So let me just quickly put these demand drivers together to show you what we think the global demand changes will be through 2016. You'll notice that the top 4 markets for growth are all emerging markets. In fact, if you exclude North America for a moment, because let's not call it emerging just yet, let's assume that it's still a developed marketplace, the top 7 markets for growth are all emerging markets. Just let me run quickly through a couple of these top ones for you. So South America has the largest growth potential of any region, reflecting both a combination of high population growth and income growth forecasts. Combine that with high income elasticity and their current high levels of beef consumption, means that they stand head and shoulders above the rest in terms of potential growth in beef consumption over this next 5-year period. Now, this beef demand could be met with a 6% expansion in Brazilian herd. With forecasts from international bodies ranging from 10 to 15% for production increases in the Brazilian herd, in Brazilian beef, Brazil's not only well placed to satisfy that demand and growth from South America, but to increase its presence globally in competition in some of the other emerging markets in which we seek to play. China's demand for beef is also growing quickly, driven largely by income growth and the resultant growth in the number of middle-income earners in the market. Imported beef consumers are in the rapidly growing middle to upper class income segments of the marketplace, and in those areas we see beef sales reported of increases of 5 to 8% in the retail sector and 10% in food service sector. That's year-on-year growth. The latter, the food service, is being driven largely by the increased use of beef in hot pots. Now, we see much of this growth potential being in manufacturing grade beef and also in the area of the frozen cuts for food service, with only a small amount of potential for growth in the chilled beef for high-end restaurant use over this 5-year period. Market access remains critical to capturing the potential demand here in China, and whether it be direct exports or transshipment, much of the growth likely is going to be transshipped unless the tight trade restrictions are reduced. Now, this is also a market in which we intend to see some of that surplus supply from South America provide a real competition for Australian exporters in the market. If we turn to South Central Asia, which has the fastest absolute population growth in the world, but a low per capita consumption of just 2.1 kilograms per head, more important here has been the consumption rise attributed to income growth of around 30 to 40% during the period. Now again, this is a story where to meet this increased demand out of South Central Asia would only require a 7% increase in India's beef production over the next 5 years. And with OECD and the FAO forecasting around 10% growth in that production, again, India not only looks like being well placed to be able to service that increased demand out of that marketplace, but also to have spare capacity in which to be competitive in many of the emerging markets with Australian beef. Middle East and North Africa has the benefit of both increasing population and increasing income levels, providing for our forecast of a 16% increase in beef consumption over the next 5 years. Now, that's going to be potentially sped up by increased stability in the region when it arrives, which will allow the further development of retail, hotel, resort facilities, which had been continuing at a rapid pace of knots. Combine that with the young population and the rapidly growing middle to high income stream, and we see real potential growth for high quality beef within this region. Now, within that region, we see limited expansion in local beef supplies. Figures aren't great across that region, but we do have OECD forecasting moderate increases or modest increases in Egypt, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Iran and Turkey in terms of their capacity to supply into the region. We do expect to have fierce competition from both Brazil and India, which are key competitors for us in this region at the moment. Brazil at that mid-level retail and the food service market level, and from India in the manufacturing sector. Now, Southeast Asia has seen tremendous growth in beef imports over the past decade, led by Indonesia, and mainly in the areas of frozen manufacturing beef and frozen cuts, with some small growth in the latter part of the decade with chilled cuts for food service. The growing middle class in Indonesia is expected to continue to increase the buying power for beef. We see the market size, the likely overall expansion of this market, the growth in suitable retail outlets, the growth in tourism, all pointing to a very bright future for Southeast Asia and for demand. We see modest increases in local supplies. Despite government ambitions on self-sufficiency, we see that increases in imports of not only beef, but of feeder cattle will be required to be able to satisfy this demand over the next 5 years. The competition again will be intense, primarily from South America and India in non-Indonesian Southeast Asian markets, with Indonesia's ban on imports from FMD countries seeing the competition in that marketplace somewhat subdued and around New Zealand and the US. Underlying this strong consumer demand in Southeast Asia is an equally strong government desire for increased self-sufficiency across the region, which makes this a very volatile market and gives us very volatile market access conditions. So when we bring together the potential of the demand drivers, what we see as the supply opportunities through to the future, the snapshot that we see is that global demand is set to grow appreciably over the next 5 years, vastly outstripping the globe's capacity to supply. That drive is driven by population and income growth in the emerging markets. Australia is well placed to be able to capture that growth and to be able to respond to the growth signals that we are getting. We expect to get increased competition. Increased potential for demand is never handed to our exporters or to our industry on a plate. It's fiercely fought for in each and every market that we operate in. We expect to continue to have fierce competition in these emerging marketplaces from the likes of Brazil and from India, and from the US and from New Zealand and some of our more traditional marketplaces. I guess in closing, we see a bright and optimistic future for Australia's beef industry, driven largely off the back of new and emerging markets as both their population and their prosperity drives them towards purchasing Australian beef. Thank you.